So I'm going to continue with session 61, Mark 14:58, or 59, which says that there is no agreement in the testimony of these false witnesses. So that I think the message there is that there were no legitimate grounds uh, to accuse Jesus. Anything that he may have said about the temple. Notice that there's no mention of an action in the temple. It doesn't say he overturned tables and drove out, people and caused a ruckus, which they would have arrested him right then and there. We saw that. Here, the accusation is that I will destroy this temple, man-made temple, and build another in 3 days. Uh, Matthew follows him and says, I could destroy this temple. Luke doesn't have it. We said he transfers that to an accusation against Stephen in Acts of the Apostles, that Jesus would destroy this temple and change the customs Moses handed down. So those things kind of go together. Jesus is disturbing mainstream Judaism and is considered a Messiah. I think we're going to get to the real accusation here in a second. But the background is this talk about the temple. And I think there's a message being delivered. Jesus is the new temple, and the old temple, whose kairos or season or time is over because the kingdom has arrived. Mark 1:15. The fig tree's time, for producing figs is over too. That flanks the temple act. We saw that some sessions ago. So I think that's background. And then in John, you also have another big tweaking of this whole accusation. Destroy this temple, Jesus says, referring to his body, and in 3 days I will raise it instead of build. So you have a very theological accusation, quote unquote, which isn't even an accusation in John. It's like an invitation to destroy by others of the temple that is Jesus. So I think when we look at it that way, we get a real glimpse of how theology is being transmitted with these kinds of narratives, which is very, very common in the Bible. Adam and Eve, or even 6-day creation, etc. These are all artistic compositions to deliver a theological message. They're not primarily historical chronicles in our sense. So now we get to the crux of this thing, which is that Jesus remained silent and made no answer. And again, reminiscent of maybe the lamb led to the slaughter, which is found in Isaiah 53, but with the background in Jeremiah also. So then again, the high priest asks him, and here it says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Which is a circumlocution for Son of God. Are you the Messiah? I think we can take this historically as a question, are you the Messiah? And Jesus' reply is, I am, ego eimi. And so he's admitted to being the Messiah. He did as much when he entered symbolically on the jackass, purebred jackass, into Jerusalem. with the tying and untying that Mark devotes so much time to, that we saw when we covered that in Mark 11. But then Jesus adds, and I used to call it guilty with an explanation, um, I am, and you will see the Son of Man. Now he switches. Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So now Jesus has said that he's not just the Messiah, but he's the Son of Man. He's definitely implying that. Whom you will see seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Of course, this is the Son of Man in Daniel 7. We spoke quite a bit about Daniel 7, especially as reflected in Mark, but just for the importance that it has. And seated at the right hand of the power, it is reminiscent of both Daniel 7, where they set up thrones. In the Jewish tradition, I think Akiva says one throne is for the Most High and the other one is for David, the Messiah. And so you have that, but you also have Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right until I put your enemies for a footstool, which Jesus has discussed in Mark 12:35. How can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David when David himself, speaking through the Holy Spirit, said, the Lord said to my Lord? If David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? So this is the importance of this, is that Jesus is going way beyond, I am the Messiah political guy, but I am really the father of David. I am really higher than David. I am really in the Son of Man category, which has all the power, all the nations, all the tongues, etc., worship him, etc., the kingdom, all that stuff in Daniel 7, which gives me the opportunity. And here, of course, you have Messiah, Son of Man, probably the chosen one of Isaiah somewhere there, especially with the passion predictions that usually use the Son of Man, 7 of them that I counted. You have what Enoch has done, a combination Redeemer figure, Son of Man, Messiah, chosen one of Isaiah, but not a suffering servant. That is what's really missing, unless you connect the dots with the Book of Wisdom, the Pais, or servant of God, and the Huios, or son of God, is a suffering servant tried in the crucible, etc., like gold, etc. You probably could connect some dots. Most scholars really think that the only one who really connected these dots of a suffering servant Messiah was Jesus. In the Jewish tradition, this delivered person in Isaiah 53 is really the temple. So the idea of a suffering Messiah is quite murky, although I think dots can be connected. But the important thing is, and I repeat again, the recommendation to read a blockbuster book by a Talmudic Jewish scholar, dissident guy, Daniel Boyarin, at Berkeley, the Jewish Gospels. And he says the real thing that, I want to use a vulgarity, that got the leaders upset was not saying I am the Son of God, in the sense maybe of an adopted Messiah, Psalm 2, or even Psalm 110, which is connected with Psalm 2 in the Jewish tradition, used that way in Hebrews. But what really got these people upset was that Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. That was a doozy. That's what Boyarin says, the Jews had a lot of discussions among themselves, heated arguments, but to be crucified for one of them must have been a real doozy. I think politically he was crucified for being a Messiah. But I think what Boyarin is saying is that within the internal Jewish debate, Jesus is at least hinting. I haven't reread his book recently. It's not a thick book. I recommend reading. It's about 110 pages. But Jesus is really hinting at way beyond this political Messiah insurrectionist, like a Bar Kokhba, in 132 of the Common Era. He was called the son of the star, but Akiva said he's the Messiah, etc. I think what's going on here is very mysterious, and I think Jesus is definitely seeing himself, especially with this Abba stuff about my father. He's really, and which is developed, of course, very much in John. The Father and I are one, and all kinds of other stuff like that. Very strong, high Christology. Here you have, in this presentation by Mark, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. It says here, in coming with the clouds of heaven. If this is smack Daniel 7, two thrones, one for the Ancient of Days, Yahweh, and then the other one for David or the Messiah, and he gets the kingdom and the glory and all these things. It certainly doesn't even leave any room for the Jewish leaders. So that if you thought about this, you would see that this is a real accusation. But I think at the historical level, you could limit it to the Jews are on the Jewish leaders are on the lookout for a messianic pretender with a following who could stir up things, as indeed would happen. In 66 BC, in the Common Era, the Jews rise up in the Jewish war against Rome, and the temple is destroyed in 70. But here you have, I think, certainly theologically, much more than simply, are you the Christ? Of course, Mark is going to downplay. I think he's probably the first guy to really downplay Roman involvement. And the crowd likes Jesus. Most of the Jews of even Jerusalem like Jesus, hang on to his every word, and they don't want to arrest Jesus because they don't want the crowd to get upset about arresting this prophet candidate for Messiah for sure. So they get him out of the way. But certainly more is going on than this, and Jesus' own presentation of himself is not, I'm trying to lead a political insurrection against Rome with one guy with one sword striking the ear of some guy, It's a heavier thing going on for sure. And the high priest tears his garments. You've heard the blasphemy, which scholars say claiming to be the Messiah is not blasphemy, but claiming what's being claimed here is blasphemy, which is broadly construed as improper speech, but they all condemned him to death. Mark is definitely presenting this as a whole Sanhedrin decision, which extremely unlikely. But he's condemned. And for Mark, the real condemnation is this one. Pilate is simply the tool who's going to yield, wanting to please the people, says Mark. In 15:15, he frees Barabbas and delivers Jesus to them after having flogged him. So what you have here is a patsy Pilate totally unhistorical. He was very, very cruel. He was removed because of cruelty. He was removed because of excessive cruelty. He entered Jerusalem insulting the Jews, and he was forced out of office for insulting the Jews and being too cruel. And he was appointed by Sejanus, Tiberius's very anti-Semitic minister. So Pilate is no friend of the Jews, I don't think. Bruce Chilton in Rabbi Jesus, who has a lot of knowledge of Aramaic, but a lot of crazy ideas too. He thinks that he tries to save the historicity of this by saying that Pilate wanted to now score some points with the Jews, etc. I don't think so. But nevertheless, what happens following is quite in line with what happens to a condemned person. He's being mocked and ridiculed, spat upon, and just laughed at, as is crucifixion supposed to be a parody of someone claiming to be a king. You would have a throne to sit on a cross, etc., and you would be raised up as in a satiric way of saying you sought exaltation. Well, now you're exalted, which, as I think I said for in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. This he said to indicate the manner of death. Well, this is a pun that works in Aramaic perfectly. To be lifted up is the same thing as to be impaled or crucified. We have an actual Aramaic example of that in Ezra, book of Ezra. Switching to Aramaic there has this very same example in chapter 6. So that in Ezra chapter 6, you have this use of this sakaf, I think, Aramaic verb, double meaning, be lifted up, be crucified. So then you have the famous Peter's denial, where a servant girl, so to speak, gets to make him be a coward. His speech is Galilean, but he denies, and then the rooster crows. And Peter remembers that Jesus had predicted this, and he breaks down and weeps, very, very famous. We talked about the watches of the night that Jesus mentions in Mark 13 with the eschatological discourse with the fig tree, the 4 different watches of the night, one of them being the cockcrow time. As soon as it was morning, this is another watch, one of the watches, but the resurrection is also that. As soon as it was morning, proi, the chief priests held consultation with the elders and scribes, and again the whole Sanhedrin, in the morning. So they had it at night and in the morning. They bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate has a very simple question: are you the king of the Jews? I'm not interested in Son of Man or clouds or anything like that. And Jesus answers Pilate, you have said it, or you say it, which I think can be interpreted as coming from your mouth. It means one thing. I'm not going to discuss with you what I really am, but if you believe me to be an insurrectionist, that's your business. I'm not going to argue with you. The chief priests accused him of many things. They're spelled out in Luke. Tells the people not to pay taxes. He's disturbing, sort of rousing up to insurrection, the people, etc., and saying he's Christ King. So Luke has it very explicitly. And at 20 minutes, we're going to stop again.